We learned in video 5 that the turning point in Luke's Gospel is recorded in chapter 9, verse 51. When the days drew near for Jesus to be taken up, that is, taken up to heaven, he set his face to go to Jerusalem. The question arises whether this journey is to be read literally or whether it's merely symbolic or metaphorical. That is it a journey that represents nothing more than universal truths about our common human experience, or is it relating particular truths about real events toward the end of Jesus' life? We have to ask this question because it's not uncommon to encounter serious-minded people who have different opinions on the matter. To resolve the question, we can review how Luke describes the beginning and ending of the journey. When we do that, we can see clearly that it's too forced to read the journey as just figurative. Let's read from the beginning of the journey in chapter 9, verse 52. Jesus sent messengers ahead of him, who went and entered a village of the Samaritans to make preparations for him. But the people did not receive him, because his face was set toward Jerusalem. The emphasis falls on a practical problem. In order for Jesus to travel from Galilee to Jerusalem, he has to pass through the interposing region of Samaria. Samaritans and Jews, of course, were famously unneighborly to one another. So when one of the Samaritan villages refuses to offer lodging to Jesus and his disciples because Jesus' face was set toward Jerusalem, the reader is confronted with a geographic and cultural scenario exactly as one would expect given what we know from history. We have no good reason to doubt that Luke's telling us about real travels in the life of Jesus and about a literal rejection by the Samaritan villagers. Now let's consider the description of the end of Christ's journey in chapter 24, verses 51 to 53. Jesus parted from them and was carried up into heaven, and the disciples worshipped him and returned to Jerusalem with great joy, and were continually in the temple blessing God. We ask again, was Jesus literally carried up to heaven, or is this a metaphor? The narrated effects on the disciples seem to resolve the question. The first effect was worship. They've clearly witnessed something so spectacular that it leads them to worship Jesus. The second effect was that they continually visited the temple to bless God. And it's clear from Luke's wording that Jesus is no longer with them on these occasions. That is, he's physically absent from both Jerusalem and anywhere else on earth. When we add these two effects together, we find that they make the best sense if we understand Luke to be describing Jesus' departure to heaven as a literal event that he believes the disciples actually witnessed. In summary, then, the description of the beginning and ending of Christ's journey indicates that the journey is best understood as a literal historical event toward the end of Christ's time on earth. But now that that's settled, we have to ask whether Christ's journey is important to Luke merely because it's a literal historical event. Is that all there is to know about it, that it simply happened? Let's look again at the beginning of Christ's journey. When the Samaritan villagers refused to lodge Christ due to religious prejudice, we read this. When his disciples James and John saw it, they said, "Lord, do you want us to tell fire to come down from heaven and consume them?" But Jesus turned and rebuked them, and they went on to another village. It's quite clear from the story that Jesus sharply chastises his disciples for their vengeful attitude toward the villagers. But for how long does Jesus expect his disciples to maintain this patient and kind attitude toward his enemies? Is his correction relevant only with regards to their physical travels to Jerusalem? Once they arrive in Jerusalem and Jesus departs to heaven, are the disciples then free to be hateful toward his enemies? Of course not. The attitude Jesus commands during the journey is assumed to apply all the same after his departure. The reason his followers draw this conclusion is because Jesus constantly describes his teachings as a reflection of the values of God's eternal kingdom. The disciples are on a spiritual journey as well as a physical one, and the challenges they face in their literal travels provide a schoolyard-type environment in which Jesus can teach them about spiritual values. For example, This first story reveals something about the fundamental nature of their spiritual journey, namely, that they'll face some measure of hatred and rejection by the world. Indeed, when we come to the end of their journey, not only do we read of Jerusalem's unneighborly treatment of Jesus, but of hatred even more extreme, for they force-march Christ outside the city walls and brutally execute him. Yet, his attitude through his passion is a model of patience and love toward his enemies. He doesn't respond to his suffering as one would who thinks there's no final judgment, or who thinks that death is the finish line of human existence. So whether it's the first or last story, the various literal experiences along the journey become symbolic of higher-level spiritual matters. So the answer to the question whether Christ's journey is to be read literally or metaphorically is yes. Luke tells us both what actually happened and how this relates to the more profound spiritual reality. But there's no doubt either that between the two, the spiritual journey is far more important to Luke than the physical one. And a practical effect of this on Luke's narrative is that he isn't always concerned to inform us of the precise geography and chronology of Jesus' travels. Though he's generally describing the literal progress of Christ's journey toward heaven, he clearly considered himself free occasionally to reorder some historical events so long as it helps to focus the reader on a more important spiritual lesson. Of course, this reordering of events isn't much different from what we do when we tell friends about our summer vacation and prioritize events according to their importance or interest, rather than according to their chronology. But what is the benefit of narrating the events of Christ's journey, both literally and symbolically? Would it be preferable for Luke to have written according to the exacting standards and dispassionate style of modern historiography? Well, let's consider the election of Barack Obama. Clearly, his election is a literal event. But isn't his election also profoundly symbolic? After all, the United States, a nation formerly dependent upon African slave labor, freely elected for the first time in its history an African-American president. One could hardly fault even a modern historian for dramatically and skillfully emphasizing this in their account. In a similar way, Luke saw in the literal travels of Jesus profound symbolism of eternal consequence, much of which Jesus himself called attention to. So for Luke to compose his biography without creatively and artfully emphasizing this would have been an unfortunate short sale of the depths of meaning in Christ's journey. This is one of the reasons why multi-millions of people have read Luke's account, while few people will ever read scholarly books on the so-called Jesus of history. In our next video, we're going to answer the question, why does Luke tell us about the journey of Jesus in stages? Why not simply tell the story in one large, all-encompassing section?